So I think it's going to be hard for the Chinese and Russians. So their dream is to build an alternative post-Western order based on these kind of platforms. But the contradictions are going to be hard.
In this week's column, in this week's Rajamandala, you looked at, of course, G20 when the meeting also the challenge to multilateralism. We've been seeing it now. We can see it with China vis-a-vis the Western, more traditional multilateral institutions. You can see it to some extent with Russia backing out of many things and becoming a sort of unfavored actor by the West after the invasion of Ukraine. One of the changes between, say, the so-called new Cold War, we can't help many people, lay people draw comparisons. And the old one is the level of economic interdependence. We see that to be, is it even if, say, the ASEAN countries, the East Asian economies, as much as they might be wary of China in terms of its aggression in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, they have deep economic ties. That's also true of India to an extent, the US to an extent. How do you see that playing out with this as the space for that kind of multipolar multilateralism goes away?
Yeah, I think you really caught on the principal problem in the economic domain is this, that for 40 years, it was very welcome to integrate with China, economically speaking, and that interdependence with China has dramatically grown because China has become the second largest economy, the factory for the world. And whether it's US or India or ASEAN, which is smaller countries, everyone was tied into the Chinese economy. So today, while on the security issues like the US, India, and others can have strong, divergences and can act upon them, for the smaller countries which are tied into the Chinese economy, like in the ASEAN, is much harder to juggle the tension between, the security and the geo-economic ones. Until now, people assumed that it was possible to do trade with China and security with the US, but that is getting more complicated. Even on the economic side, the pressure is mounting to shall we say, to decouple. Decouple not in a total sense. Take, for example, telecom networks. China was pushing Huawei, and the Americans were opposing it. So you had actually countries within the region had to choose, though everyone says we don't want to choose. The question is, would you tie yourself into Chinese telecom networks, or would you stay out? India, which depended on Chinese technology for 2G, 3G, 4G, chose not to. But there are other countries in the region which opted for the Chinese networks. This is also going to apply to the cloud systems. So do you use American cloud to store your data, or do you go to the Chinese? So I think this conflict is just beginning. And I think it is going to be a real challenge, not just for the ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries, but for the whole world. How do you disentangle? Because we saw the Americans are trying to move in that direction. India is moving in that direction. Europe is less enthusiastic. But still, the trade with everyone, with China, is growing because the nature of the interdependence that has emerged over the so many decades. So I think this problem that we believe till now, there was a single economic system run by the WTO. Today, you don't. I mean, the WTO is under pressure. The economic conflict between the major powers is making it hard to abide. There are a single set of rules you need to abide by. To one way, the competition between major powers is undermining a single system. So I think we are in a different domain.
The other thing now, moving in the piece you point out, for example, I mean, the big story here was a while ago. First, President Putin is not attending, and now Xi Jinping is not attending the G20 Summit. We know for certain. At the same time, India, the multilateralism is of a different sort. There's regional ties. I think there's a very interesting line in the piece, everyone should read it, is that a unipolar Asia with China dominance might be worse for India. And that is the understanding now than a unipolar world with American dominance, just because, if nothing else, just distance. So the neighbor, overbearing neighbor is. Everyone read the piece. It's on the indianexpress.com, and it should be wherever in the description, wherever you're watching this video. So, there is, so you have India doing the Quad, there's the AUKUS, there's Japan and Vietnam, which have their own problems with China. And these are sort of regional groupings coming about, some with European powers, some with America, some. At the same time, you see things like, as China is going to be increasingly with Russia, maybe not as or seen as an adversary in forums like the G20 or G7. How do you see, what they say try to do with BRICS, which you pointed out in one of your earlier recent articles, that they may be trying to convert this increased in BRICS membership might be a way of having your own kind of G20 alternatives now. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think the problem idea that the Chinese can build an exclusive bloc, I think there is a lot of hype about it. Chinese might be hoping for it, but we are not there yet. For example, India sits in the BRICS, it's one of the founding members, but its contradictions with China are not hidden. If you look at the speeches of Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi in Johannesburg, they were talking, opposite things. Xi Jinping was criticizing small groups like Quad. Prime Minister Modi was talking about resilient supply chains, reducing dependence on China. So I think the interests and the trajectories are different. I mean, there's no escape. For example, bringing a country like Iran, I mean, it doesn't add very much because Iran itself is under sanctions. But someday they'll be very important. But at this point, they're not. Saudi Arabia is a member of the G20. So they're already here. And their ties with the US are very, very close. A century of relationship between the House of Saud and the US is not going to disappear overnight. So I think it's going to be hard for the Chinese and Russians. So their dream is to build an alternative post-Western order based on these kind of platforms. But the contradictions are going to be hard. And I think we've argued this before. This is not the first time the notion that you can build something against the United States began. I mean, going back to the non-aligned movement, before that, pan-Islamic movement, pan-Asian movement, non-aligned movement, everyone thought they can build something big to challenge the Western order. And I think the logic of economic reform, market economics, has actually moved more countries closer to the West today than in the past. But there are a lot of resentments against the West. I think China and Russia are tapping into some of that. But tapping into resentments is not the same as building a powerful, credible platform against the US and its allies.
The final question, in the piece you point out the sort of India's new multilateralism, how it is actually India's movement, in the sense that we've been maneuvering so far, at least, quite well in these changed realities and having a greater say in a greater place. There is one thing I'd like to point out. Everyone read the piece again. It has a lot of the detail. But you touch on how this global South, India championing the global South. We've been talking about the African Union coming into G20 and a whole bunch of other things you're championing. It's not just, we don't seem selfish. It's not just about India Security Council, that kind of talk. How is it actually different from, say, the North? Because the global South, without being completely antithetical to an idea of the global North, especially as climate change and negotiations like that will become more and more tense. How do you see that difference now?
My sense is, in the past, we thought when we talked about, non-aligned movement, talked about a new international economic order, the idea that you could simply dissociate yourself from the West, nationalize resource companies, nationalize the oil companies, throw out the Western capital, keep away American technology. We also did some of that. We threw out the IBM, we nationalized the petroleum companies, we, cut ourselves off from the United States. But so by the 80s, most developing countries were already tying themselves back. The oil money was tightly linked to the West. Our technology relationships are increasingly with the West. The markets are still in the West, despite the rise of China. So the notion that you could do this trade union against the West, that has gone. What we're seeing today is that India, the developing countries of the global South need technology, need capital, need green finance. Much of this will still have to come from the West. And what India is doing is telling the West, look, it's in your own interest to facilitate this, rather than simply say, look, promise something but not deliver on climate finance, not doing enough to ensure the development of the developing countries. So I think India is putting the pressure. And I think the Chinese competition is also waking up parts of the West. For example, Japan now openly talks about supporting the global South. They want to do more for the global south. So we might see some interesting things at the summit on multilateral development banks being reformed. How do you generate more finance and support for the developing countries? So I think India's strategy is to be a bridge between the south and north, rather than mobilizing a trade union and bombarding the Western headquarters, if you will.
Great, sir. Thank you so much, everyone. Read the piece, and G20 is coming, so we will have a lot more in the Indian Express on that. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.